Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Russia and the United States, are these two countries destined to be enemies? Well, if you ask the U.S. Congress, the answer appears to be yes. Why do so many in Washington want Russia to be an enemy? Is this all about Ukraine, or does it go much deeper? To crosstalk whether the United States has declared war on Russia, I'm joined by my guest, Brian Becker in Washington. He is the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. Also in Washington, we have Martin Sieff. He is an author as well as a columnist for the Post-Examiner and a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow. And in New York, we cross to Anthony Salvia. He is a former appointee of Ronald Reagan to the U.S. State Department. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Brian, if I go to you first, looking at Resolution 758, it does look like there's some form of declaration of war against Russia. And the reason why I want to do this program is, so what do they want to do next? Do we need to go to war? Because it seems like policymakers in Washington have just gone right up to the brink, and they don't give themselves much room now. Go ahead, Brian.
The Resolution 758 in the House of Representatives is what's called a simple resolution, meaning it cannot become law unless it has a companion piece in the Senate, the other body, the other chamber of the U.S. Congress, and then would have to be signed into law by the President of the United States. So we should at least see in its form that it's a declaration, a statement, one that's made very routinely by the House of Representatives, where they can sound off and vent on anything without having to take any executive responsibility for implementation. And this, of course, is that. It's a statement, not a policy. But it has to be viewed in the context of what's going on in Washington. There is a piece of legislation, the so-called Russian Aggression Prevention Act in the Senate, which could conceivably morph into a companion piece of legislation. And the content of the statement of Resolution 758 is one of pure aggression, because it labels Russia as an aggressor, meaning the United States must be able to respond, and it gives the president, if it were to ever be implemented, authorization to go to war against Russia. It also calls for undermining the Russian government by promoting an alternative and opposition media and alternative and opposition groups within Russia. It is, in essence, a resolution promoting regime change. And in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, we have looked at the past 20 years where we can see in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, there have been these kind of resolutions that become a precursor to actual policy. So I think we should see it as part of a rising chorus of really is the military-industrial complex, which benefits, makes a lot of money when there's increased tension, but the neoconservative lobby that's had the dominant voice, not just in the Bush administration, but also in the Obama administration when it comes to Russia policy.
Okay, Tony, in New York, so, I mean, considering what Brian just said, there are plenty of people that just love to go to war with Russia. How do you feel about that, and is that a rational policy?
Well, I think we have to be clear, as Brian was suggesting, this is a non-binding resolution. This is not a declaration of any intent to have hostilities break out between the two countries. I don't think Washington is there. I don't think they want to have hostilities break out. I think there is a kind of low-key war, kind of information war, certainly, that's going on against Russia. There's an economic war that's being conducted against Russia in the form of sanctions. And I think that what this resolution does is Washington is and it's sort of official Washington is indicating where it's been all along, but more officially now, in the sense that, since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has been offering Russia basically two options: either go along with our strategic priorities, or be treated as an adversary. And that was visible in the NATO expansion right up to Russia's borders. That was visible in going after a lot of Russia's friends and clients, countries like Iraq and Syria and Libya and Serbia and all of that. This is all part. And then of course the ultimate thing was our role in the overthrow of Yanukovych in Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, this is indicative of a long-standing Washington attitude.
Okay, Martin, so I guess we know Russia has a lot to worry about because there's a long history of regime change since the end of the Cold War in Europe and around the world here. But at the same time, again, is the intent here, what Tony just said is absolutely right. You know, either go our way or the highway. This is a fundamental flaw in U.S. foreign policy. Why can't we negotiate? What about diplomacy? That seems to be out the window. But like NATO expansion, anybody can join NATO, but not Russia. This is a difference, and this is where Russia is put on the outside all the time. Go ahead.
I agree with you, Peter, and I think both the speakers made excellent points. The key point is the New York point about the conditioning. This is an unbinding resolution. It reminds me of the joke that Sam Goldwyn in Hollywood made about unwritten contracts. They're worth the paper they aren't written on. At one sense, that is true of this resolution. It is a worthless resolution. Congress is used to this. But that makes it, in a way, more dangerous in the long run. It is an outspoken resolution. You could say it's like the subconscious, the id, coming up in Congress. It expresses prejudices towards Russia. It expresses dangerous ignorance on the part of policymakers. For 20 years since the end of the Cold War, 25 years now, American policymakers and pundits have been in a world where they imagine they can do what they want, and they imagine God, democracy, and history are all on their side. So they can bungle disastrously policies like Libya and Iraq. And as far as the policymakers in Washington go, there are no consequences for them. Oh. The only consequences are to be accused of being a wimp.
Yep, that's absolutely.
But if you're up against
let me jump in here because you're right. There's no downside in getting
sure.
There's no downside in getting Russia wrong. There never has been here. You know, I just have to wonder. Maybe Victoria Nuland will be promoted in the next administration for destroying Ukraine. But we'll get there when we get there. Brian, let me go to you because you know the countries that we've mentioned here about regime change. Because I think this is exactly where I wanted to go. You know, if we look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq, you look at Libya. These countries are not a threat. They're no military threat to the West. But then again, you know, well, let me go to Brian here. But when Russia says it draws a red line, you know what? People tend to pay attention because I don't say it very often. This is a red line. And this is Russia's, over the last few months, I was in Valdai. I listened to President Putin basically give his red lines. And no one in the media really takes it seriously, never reads it. This is what's dangerous. Brian in Washington, go ahead.
Exactly.
It's an expression of the arrogance of power, and it has, you know, from time after time after time, if you look at what happened in Vietnam or what happened in Iraq or what's happened in Afghanistan, the arrogance of power, the idea that we have the greatest military, we outspend every other country by the next 20 countries combined, we have the most money in intelligence agencies, we're the dominant economy. And so we can make dictates, and those who don't follow our dictates, those who defy the empire, for instance, must be brought down, even if they profess neutrality, because their neutrality can be understood or perceived by others that they too could be neutral when it comes to the dictates of the empire. So you have the logic of empire dictating policy, and of course, as the other speakers mentioned, that's created massive foreign policy failures, but again, no consequences to pay. What's really going on with the U.S.-Russian relationship, I think, is this, that if Russia was treated as an equal, if there was not constant tension, what we would see is a reorganization of Europe where Germany in particular would be allowed to abandon or would seek to abandon its post-World War II Cold War relationship as the junior partner for the U.S. empire and probably affiliate with Russia, a more natural trading partner, a closer trading partner, and one where they have historic ties. The United States needs to maintain a constant sort of tension against Russia, and that includes, of course, the constant NATO expansion right up to Russia's border. And now I think what we will see is war games, including war games with nuclear weapons on Russia's border. That pushes Russia back. It says this is America's red line. No matter what Putin says, the United States won't stop in this policy. But vital to the whole scenario is maintaining the old NATO alliance, which requires tension, requires a time of confrontation. Otherwise, Germany and Europe would reorient towards Russia, or at least big parts of Europe.
Okay.
So this is part of a bigger game plan by the United States to maintain U.S. hegemony instead of peace.
Okay, let me go to Tony in New York here. You know, one of the things in Western media always forgets, to my mind, is that resolution that we're talking about was translated into Russian. Russians read it. And the seething anger of the average person that reads that say, why are they writing this about us? We don't go around the world invading countries. We don't go around the world doing this. And this is a country of its arrogance. And then you have Victoria Nuland with her phone call, the telephone call, and they destroy the country right next to us, where a lot of Russian people live. You know, a lot of policymakers fail to remember that that's how, you know, the Russians see Washington. They never look at the other side of the coin. Go ahead, Tony.
You know, it's not good for U.S.-Russian relations and how the Russian people view Washington. I mean, and this has been on a downward slide ever since the Yeltsin years, when right after the fall of communism, there was a lot of sympathy for the U.S. and Russia. I was living in Russia at the time under Yeltsin and in Moscow, and you know, we've never recovered. It's been one blow to the relationship after another, and to the perception that Russians have of America and Americans. And it's really unfortunate. And I think, you know, there's an alternative to all this, and it gets to something Brian was saying. There's, you know, it is dire. On the other hand, you know, I used to work for Ronald Reagan, and Reagan, with Gorbachev, was working towards, you know, ending the Cold War. The idea was to think about a new security and architecture for the Northern Hemisphere, you know, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, but incorporating North America as well. A new zone of economic and security cooperation in Europe. Where Russia would be integrated, you know, and where you wouldn't have, you know, I mean, that was implicit in everything that Reagan and Gorbachev were doing, and was the motive behind Reagan's, you know, real insistence on ending the Cold War, even against opposition within his own administration. And it was not a neo-imperialist thing on his part. And unfortunately, with Serbia, the whole and the people who came to power at that time, the whole thing was reversed.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russian-American relations. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Martin in Washington. I'd like to kind of continue on the absurdity of how Russians see U.S.-Russian relations. As I was going to the studio to record this program with you, gentlemen, I was reading across some interesting articles how the European officials have been contacting Moscow and asking them, you know, pretty please, can you delay or put off Ukraine's payment of the $3 billion that it borrowed from Russia before all this nonsense started in Ukraine, and you know, the Russians saying, let me get this straight. You want us to cut your new client state a break, and you want to continue sanctioning us. And this is what Russians are talking about, the absurdity of it all. You want to sanction us, but you want to punish us, and you want us to help your new client state. What do you want us really to do?
Peter, I agree with you, and I think you've hit the nail on the head here. The problem here is not malevolence from Washington so much as incredible stupidity and arrogance and incompetence from Washington and Brussels. European Union and US policies towards Russia and Ukraine are like that of a terribly bad poker player. Worst poker player you can ever imagine. He has a lousy hand, and all he thinks he can do is double up and bluff. And if you call his bluff, there's nothing behind it. It's a panic-stricken ploy.
You know, Brian, you know, when I look at, obviously people that watch this program know that we've been covering Ukraine ever since the events of November last year, and particularly since the coup in February. And the number of times that the Russian side has asked for trilateral talks, finding a new venue to de-escalate, trying to find a way to keep Ukraine from disintegrating. You know why? Because a failed state on Russia's border is not good for Russia. Maybe that's what Victoria Nuland's B plan is. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, negotiation and treating each other as equals is important, and I would say respecting democratic principles, the democratic vote of people in Ukraine, not just the ones you like, but everyone. Go ahead, Brian.
Ukraine is now a United States satellite country. They carried out a U.S.-sponsored coup d'etat using fascist forces, literally fascist and neo-Nazi forces, to overthrow the existing government, the democratically elected government, and put into place a puppet, Poroshenko. And what has he said? That the top priority of Ukraine, the top priority in a country where people are hungry, in a country where people are suffering from unemployment and all sorts of social and economic problems, the top priority is to integrate into NATO, a military alliance. That shows that Poroshenko is nothing but an extension of American power. So then the question is, why does American power act like this? Why so provocative? One, because they believe that they can do whatever, that ultimately Russia will not be able to overturn NATO's eastern expansion. They expected to be able to swallow up Ukraine whole. And we see now that the Russian government, like any government, whether it be Putin or any government in Russia, one that's no longer on its knees as it was right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, would be absolutely required for its own national interests, including vital security interests, to stand up to them. And that immediately becomes the catalyst for a new round of escalated rhetoric, military spending, and threats of aggression, including war games on Russia's border, including in the Baltics.
Yeah, Tony, if I can go to you in New York, you know, it was last week, 2 weeks ago, when the South Stream project that Vladimir Putin announced he was canceling, and everybody was caught flat-footed, like, what did he say? And, well, Brussels had been pushing for a long, long time to have it, you know, not go through. They actually passed legislation in the middle of the game, which is against every legal principle you can imagine. And everyone's saying, but, you know, but Russia doesn't know its national interest. Well, that's the whole point here. This is what the problem is here, is that the United States does not recognize that Russia does very clearly understand its national interest. You may not have to agree with them. That's fine. But it does understand what they are. And Russia will defend them, irrespective of who is president of this country. These ad hominem attacks on the president of Russia is just ridiculous. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, yeah, I mean, Russian policy is clearly motivated by a very realist sense of what is at stake for Russia, what Russia needs to do to secure its situation and to defend itself against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we used to have a national interest-based foreign policy. We don't anymore. It's more and more dictated by a kind of democratist ideology and to justify a policy of incessant expansion and the exercise of power in every nook and cranny of the globe. And you know, the trouble for us is we can't afford it. I mean, we can print money, which is what we're doing. You can keep it going, I guess, for a while. But you know, ultimately, there's going to be a reckoning here. And meanwhile, you know, Russia, you know, is under duress because of what's happening, the policy of the Western powers to rein it in, to box it in, and all of that. But if Russia sticks to what it's doing, it's on the right course. This is the only option it has, is a national interest-based policy, the hard-headed calculation of what's in its interest. And that explains the decision on South Stream, which ultimately was a very rational decision, and they should have seen it coming.
Yep, they should have.
The Europeans.
Martin, you know, I will be counterintuitive against what Western media says. That's probably what my calling card these days, is that, you know, the sanctions, yes, they do hurt. It does pinch. But there have been so many of us that have lived here for so long that we needed a Pearl Harbor event to really make the government think about serious, hard reforms that are painful to go through. Because when there's a lot of oil money around, you get complacent. Now we have low oil, we have sanctions, and now there's a segment of the population saying it's about time we had our own Swiss system, we had our own way of dealing with the outside world. We don't need to go through all these Western banks because they're all toxic, they're all built on a house of cards. Russia is moving away from that. In a way, if we take the day-to-day impact, on a larger scale, this is a godsend.
I think you make a key point there, Peter. There is a tendency in Brussels and Washington, a huge tendency, to think within the bubble, to imagine that not even Europe, but not even the European Union, but the policymakers in Brussels, New York, and Washington, and London are all that matter in the world. China is rising. India is rising. Asia spends more on building up its armed forces than Europe, including Russia, including all NATO members except for the United States combined. American major corporations have far better business in arms exports to Asia than they do in Europe. The drive to destabilize Europe is not coming from the military-industrial complex. It's not coming from Wall Street. It's not coming from American big business. American business wants good relations with Russia. It's not coming from them. It's coming from this mad drive to democratize the world on purely American lines, on the lines of the American 21st century imagination. Okay. And that's the problem.
Okay, well, Brian, the problem is that, you know, democratization is a masquerade for empire. I mean, it's laughable. I'm sure the people in Libya feel...
It's a masquerade for something.
Well, no, but I'm sure the people of Libya and Iraq and Syria and all these other places feel, you know, now they have Thomas Jefferson in their veins. I'm sure they're very happy about how America came and visited them. Go ahead, Brian, because this is ridiculous. Go ahead.
Yes, I agree. The democratization thing is nothing more than a ruse. It's a slogan. It has no real vision that the United States is bringing democracy anywhere. I mean, the United States doesn't really care about the form of government in any other part of the world. It cares about whether those governments are either allies or puppets or close friends or willing to do the bidding of the United States, the bidding of the empire. So it's not about democratization. I would take issue with that. And it is about the military-industrial complex. It is about Wall Street. It is about the biggest banks and corporations. And it is about the neoconservatives who are driving and have been driving since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where they saw, not in the end of the Cold War, but new real estate that could be grabbed up. They saw new places where American military bases could be positioned. At first, for the first year or two, there was a fantasy under Yeltsin when Russia was on its knees that Russia could be pushed around forever. But ultimately, when Russia regained its balance, when it showed that it could resist, then it became targeted. In 1917, when Russia had its revolution, it was invaded by 14 Western countries. It was sanctioned. It was blockaded. It endured all that, and yet it became the second strongest economy in the world during the Soviet period. The Russian people and their allies have a lot of experience with sanctions and blockades because no country had been more blockaded or sanctioned than that, and yet they endured. And I think the big question in Russia will be the political and economic policies that allow Russia to become truly independent, self-reliant, so that they can endure what I believe will be a very long, decades-long assault by the Western countries led by the United States.
Well, I can tell you from living here that there's a lot of support. There's a lot of support for just for what we heard from Brian here. Let me go to Tony, because Tony, you lived in Russia. I have to believe at some level you have some kind of affection for the country. How do we move away from this? Well, move away from the Rubicon here, because when you start calling someone another Hitler, this is another Munich, and all, you know, you get to a dead end rhetorically, because then it doesn't inform coherent, rational policy. Where do we go from here, Tony?
Well, yeah, that's certainly true. That kind of rhetoric does not help at all. Yeah, I mean, it's a question of dealing with Washington, because what happens in Brussels is ultimately drives from Washington, right? So you have to deal with Washington, deal with these policymakers, reach them with a different vision of Russia, you know, and its potential as a U.S. partner. And when I say partner, I mean real partner. Not, you know, not just a real partner, not just rhetorically, you know, because in terms of what the U.S. is trying to do in Iran right now, Russia is critical to that. It doesn't make sense to be trying to body slam the Russian economy when you need Russian agreement and help to get the Iranians to come to a reasonable deal, and then to sustain that deal over time, make it work. And we see that across the board in terms of how Russia could be helpful in dealing with South, because Russia borders in every key strategic part of the world, from East Asia to South Asia to Europe.
And almost every single international problem should have and could have Russian input. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
I love his voice.